I want you to imagine waking up on a floor that isn't a floor. It's warm. It's breathing. And the first thing you see, when your eyes finally focus, is 31 pairs of red eyes looking down at you like you're the first sunrise they've seen in 1,000 years. That's how Corin Vale's story starts. Not with a battle, not with a rescue, with a man lying flat on his back in the dark, surrounded by women who hadn't fed in longer than his species had known fire. My name doesn't matter much in this story. I was just the courier who found the wreckage log 3 years later and pieced this together from black box data, survivor testimony, and one very long, very tired debrief tape that the Colonial Registry still keeps sealed under half a dozen clearance codes. I'm going to tell it to you the way Corin told it to the review board, because frankly, nobody could tell it better than a man who lived through it. Corin Vale was 29 years old, a cargo hauler working the bleak line, that stretch of dead space between the outer human colonies and the old pre-war trade routes nobody bothered patrolling anymore. Not glamorous work. He flew a beat-up hauler called the Meridian's Debt, hauling grain synthesizers and water reclaimers to colonies too small and too broke to matter to anyone but themselves. He wasn't a hero. He'd tell you that himself first thing before you even asked. I wasn't brave, he said on that tape, voice flat and a little hoarse. I was just too stubborn to die scared. The night it happened, he was 3 days out from Colony Perch 9, running low on fuel because he'd taken a longer route to avoid a pirate corridor that had lit up 3 ships in the past month. Smart move, he thought. Except smart moves don't account for asteroid fields that aren't on any chart because the chart is 11 years old, and nobody updates charts for empty space nobody flies through. He didn't even see the rock that hit him. Just felt the Meridian's Debt buck sideways like a spooked animal, heard the screaming of metal that no engineer ever wants to hear, and then the world went white, then black, then nothing. When he woke up, he wasn't in his ship anymore. He was in a corridor. Stone, or something like stone, dark gray, veined with threads of dull red light pulsing slow, like a heartbeat set to half speed. The air smelled like copper and old rain, and it was cold, not freezing, just cold enough that his breath fogged a little when he finally managed to sit up and take stock of himself. 2 ribs cracked, a gash above his eyebrow that had already scabbed, which meant he'd been out longer than a few minutes. His flight suit was torn at the shoulder, and his ship, his beautiful, stubborn old ship, was nowhere in sight. First thing I thought, he said on the tape, wasn't where am I, it was who patched me up. Because somebody had. There was a bandage on my ribs that I sure as hell didn't put there. That's when he heard the breathing. Not his own, multiple. Slow, controlled, coming from the shadows just past where the corridor opened into something wider. A chamber, he'd learn later, that had been carved by hand, generation after generation, into the belly of a dead moon. He didn't call out. He told the board that was the stupidest kind of brave, staying quiet not because he had a plan, but because he genuinely didn't know if his voice still worked. Then one of them stepped into the light. He said her name was Threnody. Not her real name. He learned later that their real names weren't meant for outsiders, not ever, and what she gave him was closer to a title than an identity, something like the one who watches the door. But he called her Threnody because that's the closest human word he had for the sound her voice made when she finally spoke. His name was Director Havorson Cray, Colonial Resettlement Office, and Corin said the man had the particular calm of someone who'd spent a career saying no to people, and had gotten very good at making it sound reasonable. He didn't yell, he didn't sneer. That would have almost been easier, Corin said. He just had this way of talking about 11 years like it was a line item. Legacy obligation, unfunded treaty carryover. Like Vess wasn't a person who nearly killed herself keeping a reactor alive, so a signal could reach a ship that almost didn't stop. The treaty was real. Corin had dug it up himself. 3 species. A joint listening post, decades-old paper promising support and relief rotation that had simply never come because budgets got cut and nobody upstream cared enough to notice 31 people quietly starving in the dark. Cray's office didn't dispute the treaty existed. They disputed whether it was still actionable, which was a word Corin said he grew to hate more than almost any other word in any language. He told me, and I remember this exact line, he said, "Mr. Vale, sentiment doesn't reopen closed budget lines." And I looked at him and I said, "Then I'll make it a very loud sentiment." He wasn't bluffing. Part 3: Building the Noise. Corin didn't have money, didn't have rank. What he had was a working comm license, a reputation among bleak line haulers as a straight shooter, and 31 witnesses whose testimony, once it started circulating, made even hardened cargo pilots go quiet at the bar. He started small, a public log entry on the hauler network, just the facts, no embellishment. He didn't need embellishment. 11 years, a dying reactor, a woman named Vess burning out her own strength to save a signal window that closed 1 minute after it opened. People shared it. Then shared it again. Fenn, the hardware genius who'd rigged the relay cable with him, turned out to have a cousin working comms on a mid-sized news relay out of Perch 9, and within 2 weeks the story wasn't just hauler gossip anymore. It was a segment, then a follow-up, then a very uncomfortable interview request sent directly to Director Cray's office, which his staff declined to answer, which of course only made the story bigger. "I'm not proud of playing it that way," Corin admitted. "Using the story like a lever, but I'd made a promise in a dark room to people who'd been forgotten once already, and I wasn't going to let them get forgotten twice just because I was too polite to make a scene." Threnody found out what he was doing about a month in. He said she came to find him in the small rented room he'd been staying in near the way station, and she didn't say thank you. She said something else, something that stuck with him more. She said, "You don't owe us this." And I told her I didn't owe her the 8 weeks either. Nobody owes anybody the decent thing. You just do it or you don't. Part 4: The Hearing. It took 4 months to force an actual hearing. A real one, with a review board instead of a single director's office, sitting in judgment of a treaty most of them had never heard of before Corin's noise campaign landed on their desks. Corin testified first. Kept it plain, no theatrics, just the facts of the crash, the 8 weeks, the careful, deliberate way 31 starving women had asked permission before touching him even once. He said the board went very quiet during that part. Then Threnody testified. Corin said watching her stand in that sterile hearing room, thin and gray-skinned and dignified in a way that made the officials in their pressed uniforms look small by comparison, was the proudest he'd felt in the whole ordeal. She didn't beg. She laid out 11 years, plainly, the same patient way she'd laid out the treaty terms to Corin back in the dark. No embellishment needed there either. Orsa spoke about the medical toll, the malnutrition, the reactor radiation exposure they'd all quietly absorbed, keeping the station's systems alive longer than they were rated for. Fenn brought the hardware logs, showing exactly how close the whole station had come to total failure, more than once, in just the 8 weeks Corin had witnessed, let alone the 11 years before him. And then Vess spoke, barely 40, voice small in that big room. She didn't talk about suffering. She talked about the calendar Kest kept, the hand-carved notches, and she said the thing that Corin repeated on the tape like it had rearranged something in his chest permanently. She said, "We didn't ask to be remembered because we thought we deserved special treatment. We asked because the treaty said someone would come. We just wanted someone to keep their word, once, so the next people this happens to might get to believe someone will." The board recessed for 6 hours. Corin said it was the longest 6 hours of his life, longer than the 8 weeks in the dark, because in the dark he'd had something to do with his hands. Part 5: The Verdict and What Came After. The board ruled for enforcement. Full back support allocation, medical care, resettlement funding, And the part that mattered most to Corin, the part he pushed hardest for formal acknowledgement on record that the 11-year lapse constituted treaty negligence on the colonial side, not an oversight to be quietly buried. Director Cray's office issued a brief statement, no apology. Corin said he stopped expecting one somewhere around month 2. It didn't matter. 31 women who'd spent over a decade being nobody's priority walked out of that hearing with resettlement paths, medical support, and something that mattered more than any of it, proof, on record, permanent, that what happened to them had been seen, named, and answered. They scattered across 3 colonies over the following year, rebuilding in the specific unhurried way people rebuild when they've finally stopped having to ration everything, including hope. Kest kept writing her terrible jokes, mailing them to Corin across half the sector. Fenn took work refitting old station hardware, said she liked machines better than people most days but made an exception for the crew. Orso went back to medicine, properly this time, credentialed and respected instead of scavenging half-remembered training in the dark. Vess planted something. Corin never said what, some kind of flowering vine, apparently, on the balcony of the small resettlement unit she'd been given. He said when he visited, months later, it had grown enough to cover the whole railing. She told me she wanted to grow something on purpose for once, something that just got to exist because it was allowed to, not because it had to fight for every day it stayed alive. Threnody stayed close to Corin the whole year, through the hearing, through the resettlement chaos, through every tired night arguing with officials who'd rather the story just quietly go away. He said somewhere in that year, without either of them really naming it, she stopped being someone he was fighting for and became someone he was simply, permanently, with. She was tall, taller than him by a head, skin the pale gray-blue of moonlight on water, and her eyes, he kept coming back to the eyes in every version of the story, were a deep, banked red, like embers that hadn't been fed in a long time but hadn't gone out either. She didn't attack, Corin said. She just looked at me, like she was trying to decide if I was food or furniture or something else entirely. And then she said something in a language that hit my translator wrong for a second, garbled static, and then it clicked into place, and she said, "You're the first warm thing that's come through that door in 11 years. That's when the others came. 30 more of them filing into the chamber in near silence, moving the way water moves when it's being careful not to spill. Corin said he counted them twice because his brain refused to believe the first count. 31 women vampiric, he'd learned, though not in the way old human stories told it. Not immortal monsters, a species, the Caliph. Long-lived, yes, centuries, not decades, but mortal. And starving, in the specific and terrible way, an entire isolated outpost starves when its supply lines get cut and nobody in the wider galaxy remembers you exist anymore. They didn't feed on blood the way legend said. Corin learned that later, and it changed how he understood everything that followed. The Caliph fed on something closer to bioelectric charge, a kind of energy exchange that required touch and trust, and for reasons the colonial xenobiologists still argue about, worked far more efficiently with certain other species than with their own kind. Human biochemistry, as it turned out, was unusually rich in exactly what they needed. Which meant Corin Vale had just crash-landed into the single most valuable thing 31 starving women had seen in over a decade. And not one of them touched him without asking first. That's the part people don't believe, he told the board. They hear vampire and 31 women and their brain goes straight to nightmare or straight to something else, some fantasy. It wasn't either. It was the most careful, most deliberate thing I've ever watched a room full of desperate people do. They were starving. I could see it, the way their hands shook a little, the way a couple of the younger ones had gone hollow around the eyes. And still, every single one of them asked. Threnody knelt beside him that first night, close enough that he could feel the cold radiating off her skin like she was a stone left out after sunset, and she told him plainly. Their outpost had been a listening station once, decades back, a joint venture between 3 species monitoring a dead trade route for pirate activity. Then the funding dried up. Then the war nobody talks about anymore rerouted every supply ship in the sector. Then, one by one, the other species evacuated, and the Caliph, bound to the station by old treaty obligations, they refused to break even after everyone else stopped caring, stayed. 11 years, no resupply, no relief. Just 31 women rationing whatever bioelectric charge they could scavenge from the station's dying reactor core, going weaker every year, watching each other fade a little at a time, and pretending not to notice. She asked me, Corin said, and his voice cracked here right on the tape, if I'd let them take just a little, enough to keep going a few more months. And she said if I said no, that was the end of it. No argument, no second asking. They'd patched me up because that's what you do for a stranded person, not because they expected payment. He said yes. Not because he was scared. He was clear about that more than once. He said yes because he'd looked around that stone chamber and seen 31 people trying to die with dignity, quietly, without asking the universe for help it had already decided not to give them. And something in him, stubborn, the same stubborn that got him through the crash, refused to let that happen while he was standing right there with something to give. He stayed 8 weeks, long enough for his ribs to heal wrong and then get reset properly by a Caliph physician named Orsa who had, in another life, before the war rerouted everything, trained on a human medical vessel, and still remembered enough anatomy to do it right. Long enough for Corin to learn 31 names, 31 habits, 31 small, unbearable kindnesses that added up to a family he never expected to find in the belly of a dead moon. He said Lyra hummed when she was nervous. He said Kest kept a hand-carved calendar on the wall of her quarters, 1 notch per day, 11 years of notches because she refused to lose count of how long they'd been forgotten. He said the youngest of them, a woman named Vess who wasn't even 40, which for a Caliph was barely past childhood, used to sit near the reactor core at night just to feel the warmth and pretend it was sunlight. They weren't monsters waiting for me to slip, Corin said. They were people who'd been failed by everyone whose job it was to remember them. And somehow in the middle of that they still had room to laugh. Kest told terrible jokes, genuinely terrible. I groaned every time and she loved it. He gave what he could when he could, always on his terms, always asked first, and in return they gave him something he hadn't expected. Purpose. A place. For 8 weeks, Corin Vale wasn't a broke courier running the bleak line for scraps. He was the warm thing that walked through the door, and 31 women who'd forgotten what it felt like to be looked after learned, slowly, carefully, to look after him instead. They fixed pieces of the Meridian's debt wreckage, what could be salvaged, using tools older than Corin's grandparents. Threnody sat with him some nights and asked him questions about Earth, about oceans, about the specific stupid joy of eating something fried on a boardwalk, and he realized halfway through those conversations that he was the one being comforted as much as he was comforting them. But 8 weeks of borrowed time on a dying station only stretches so far. Part 4, The Signal and the Storm. It was Orsa who found it, a flicker in the station's old comm array, buried under a decade of dust and disuse. A relay ping. Faint, degraded, almost nothing. But real. Somewhere out past the dead trade route, a colonial patrol frigate had drifted close enough to catch the very edge of the station's emergency beacon, the one nobody had bothered checking in years because nobody believed it still worked. The frigate wasn't looking for them. It was running a routine sweep, months behind schedule, half-staffed, barely paying attention. It would pass through the beacon's range for exactly 41 minutes before continuing on and vanishing back into silence for who knew how many more years. 41 minutes to get a working signal out. 41 minutes on a station with a failing reactor, ancient equipment, and 31 people who'd learned the hard way not to hope for things like this. Nobody wanted to try, Corin said. Not because they didn't want rescue, because they'd hoped before. Every one of them had a story about a signal that almost worked, a ship that almost noticed, and I watched Threnity's face when Orsa told her, and it wasn't excitement. It was this. Careful, guarded nothing, like she was protecting herself from the fall before it happened. Corin was the one who pushed. He knew comm systems, cargo haulers live and die by them, and he told them, flat out, that he wasn't going to sit in a dead station and watch a rescue slip past because everyone was too scared to try. They rigged it together. Him, Orsa, a sharp-eyed woman named Fen who turned out to be a genius with old-world hardware, and 6 others running relay cable through corridors that hadn't seen foot traffic in years. The reactor groaned under the strain of powering the boosted signal. Twice it flickered and nearly died completely, and twice Vess, small, barely 40 Vess, put her hands flat against the core housing and gave it what little charge she had left in her, because she said simply, "I'd rather burn out trying than freeze here waiting." That line stuck with Corin. He repeated it on the tape like it mattered more than almost anything else that happened down there. At the 11-minute mark, the signal caught. At the 30-minute mark, the frigate answered. At the 40-minute mark, 1 minute before the window closed forever, the reactor finally failed for real, plunging half the station into darkness, and it didn't matter because the message was already through, already logged, already impossible to unsend. The frigate crew that boarded the station 3 days later, because even an emergency response takes 3 days out on the bleak line, found something they weren't prepared for. Not monsters, not a horror story. They found 31 exhausted, malnourished, fiercely dignified women standing in a receiving line like they were greeting royalty instead of being rescued, and 1 human courier standing in the middle of them, refusing to leave first. "They wanted to send me out on the first shuttle," Corin said. "Said I was the priority survivor human, needed medical attention. I told them no. I told them I wasn't going anywhere until every single one of those women had a seat guaranteed. They looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. I don't regret it." The Colonial Registry ended up classifying the rescue as a forgotten treaty enforcement, which meant, bureaucratically, that the Caliph were owed 11 years of back support, medical care, and relocation assistance. A technicality that took people arguing on Corin's behalf, loudly and repeatedly, to actually get enforced. He spent the better part of a year making noise in offices that didn't want to hear it, because he'd made a promise, quietly, to 31 people in a dark stone room, that he wouldn't let them be forgotten twice. He didn't stay a courier after that. Last anyone heard, he still flies the bleak line, but not alone anymore. Threnody flies with him now, co-pilot's seat, and the rest of them, scattered now across 3 resettled colonies, rebuilding lives that had been paused for 11 years, still call him, still check in, still send him terrible jokes that Kest apparently never stopped writing. Ending line. Corin Vale crashed into the coldest, darkest place he'd ever been, and found 31 women who'd been forgotten by everyone except each other. He didn't save them because he was fearless. He saved them because somewhere out past the edge of every chart, in a place nobody remembered to look, he refused to let being forgotten be the last thing that ever happened to them.